All right, I'll get us started. We've got a bit of a palate cleanser for any of you who've been in the hall today. It's said that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and that's really what today's session is about. I'm David Rhodes. I'm president of CBS News. I'm a young global leader of the forum and on the International Media Council. Like our guest today, Hilaree O'Neill, I'm about the same generation, have two boys about the same age, live in the same country, but Hilaree has climbed two 8,000-meter peaks more than I have, skied down one of them, hopes to ski down the other, did that, by the way, and stayed in the so-called zone of death for 48 hours straight, and on from there, the dissimilarities accumulate. You'll be so inspired by Hilaree's story of what she's accomplished, and critically, what she's accomplished often after having had some really severe setbacks, which you'll hear about too. I've got some questions, and after Hilaree's presentation, I'll have those. I'd really like to get your questions here in the room. And we're being webcast around the world. It's 7 a.m. in Colorado, maybe 10 p.m. in Tokyo, thereabouts. We'll get those questions as well after we hear from everybody in the room. We've got a limited time, about a half hour total, so let's get right to it. Hilaree, take it away.
Thanks, David. We do have one other thing in common, skiing, right? A little bit. Thanks for coming. I'm going to jump right in. So I've spent my entire adult life climbing and skiing really big mountains all over the world. Failure in my line of work can often mean life or death. But when the risk and the suffering, the frozen toes actually pay off, the depth of appreciation for the success is great. And why is that? It's because I've experienced the opposite in failure. Only through struggling and frustration, shame and heartbreak can I appreciate what it's like to come out the other side. I've learned that there are many fortunes to be found in failure. I've been doing this for 25 years, but there are three that really stand out to me. The first is that failure frees us from perfection. The second, failure, especially in my line of work, forces us to face our own mortality. And mortality teaches us gratitude, and gratitude is the foundation for real joy. 3, failure means you have the courage to step out of your box and try something unknown to you. This creates character and empathy by exposing vulnerability. Character cannot be developed in ease and quiet. Only through experience of trial and suffering can the soul be strengthened, ambition inspired, and success achieved. Helen Keller. So I grew up the youngest of 3 kids. You can't have a slideshow without having like the dirty child photo over here. My mom sewed all of our clothes when I was growing up in matching outfits, which was torture for my brother. I grew up comfortable. I always had food on the table. I had great friends. I had great grades, and I knew my family loved me. My first failure that I vividly recall was losing our state championship basketball game. So I've been playing with the same team my entire life. We were awesome. We were undefeated, yet we lost. It was heartbreaking, but it did set my life on its present path by freeing me from my own perceptions of perfection. I'd failed, but I wasn't struck down by lightning. How many of you guys have felt like, oh my God, if I fail, I'm never going to be able to look at myself in the mirror again? Life went on, despite my worst fear being realized. Now, take into account that at 17, if losing a basketball was my worst fear, then I obviously needed to get some more perspective. I graduated university with a degree in the sciences, but you can see I put a ski photo up here versus something that had anything to do with studying. I tell my parents now that I had a second major in skiing, So needless to say, I tucked away my biology degree and I moved to Chamonix, France. I was supposed to be there for a season, and I ended up living there for 6 years. Eventually, I got an opportunity with the North Face to get a paid job to go to India as a ski mountaineer. So for me to get paid to ski, I didn't even know that existed. So I went to this interview, and they assumed that I knew how to winter camp. I was familiar with helicopters. I'd spent time at altitude. I just nodded my head, smiled. 2 weeks later, I was in the Indian Himalayas. And of course, it was the first time I'd ever been in a helicopter, the first time I'd ever been winter camping, and the first time that I'd ever been at altitude. And while the trip wasn't a success in that we stood on the top of the mountain, I thought it was an incredible success because, well, I didn't die, for starters, and I didn't kill anybody. But it inspired a passion in me. I finally found myself in the arena. I was the one whose face was marred. I saw the potential for triumph through sweat and blood, and I felt like I was finally daring greatly. So from that point, I went on a barrage of expeditions, to say the least. I was beyond passionate. I was obsessed. I ran with wild camels in Mongolia. I saw the strength and passion of an eagle hunter. I learned that a Khampa Tibetan warrior, when he sticks his tongue out at you, he's not making a face, he's actually just saying hello. Who knew? Did anybody else know that? No? I scared myself a lot, clinging to ice and snow deep in the Arctic Circle, ocean-bound in a very small schooner across the Scotia Sea. I went skiing with a loaded rifle over my shoulder in case we needed to scare off polar bears. And I hung out with penguins, hundreds of thousands of penguins. And while they smell absolutely awful, I could have sat on that rock forever. I found a new community beyond my childhood friends and teammates. I learned that the value in trust and the necessity of being able to rely on a team when the road gets rocky. I also learned that a 3 a.m. alpine start, has anybody had a 3 a.m. alpine start? One, oh yes, there's a couple in here. It's really hard and it's really uncomfortable, but it's almost always worth it. So coinciding with my expeditions, I spent 10 years working as a heli ski guide. I also got married, and I had 2 little boys. They're a little older than this now. But despite all my travels, my biggest failure happened in my own backyard in Telluride, Colorado. So not long after the birth of my second son, I went back to work, my first day back at work. I showed up to guide a group of skiers in the mountains in my backyard. This story is a little harder to tell, so bear with me. At the end of our second run, we had a tricky exit to get back to the helicopter. We had a river crossing, so I sent the rest of the group ahead to sort of break in the track, and I stayed behind with my most timid skier. As she crossed the river, she lost her balance and she fell backward into this stream. Her head was forced under an undercut rock by the pressure of the flowing water, and within a minute, she drowned. So all my life, I've associated God, or identified God, if you will, with Mother Nature. And I think that's because, as a child, I spent so much more of my time in the wilderness than I did in a church. So Mother Nature is my best friend, my sanctuary. And she'd strip me of my sense of control and my pride. All external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, these things just fall away in the face of death, leaving only what is truly important. Steve Jobs is talking about his own mortality, and in that mortality, he found gratitude. What if we could have that gratitude by learning from our own failures, that gratitude and that joy, instead of really recognizing gratitude only when our time is limited? So not long after the accident, I went to Mount Everest on a National Geographic expedition. My children were 2 and 4 at the time. They're amazing little boys. But I was still wallowing in the huge shadow of this accident. I was at rock bottom, I remember very well, not sleeping for nearly 2 years. And I kind of thought that by climbing the tallest mountain in the world, I hoped to stretch my soul so thin through suffering that I might somehow understand Mother Nature again and simultaneously forgive myself. So there's no escaping mortality on Everest. Believe it or not, the very day we left to go for our own summit attempt, 7 people perished that day. Because of the long lines on Everest, they were stuck in a storm and died due to exposure, their oxygen tanks ran out, and altitude illness kicked in. So 5 days later, our own team, our entire team, stood on the summit. But it didn't feel like the success I'd imagined that it would. And not only because of the bodies along the way, but because it's such a well-trodden path up Mount Everest, which seems crazy, but there are ropes the entire way. And those ropes eliminate that need and that reliance on a partner. You can do it all by yourself. The lines of people also forced me to climb in a way that was incredibly unnatural and foreign to me. So, of course, to counter that, my partner and I just decided to keep climbing, keep walking. And the next dawn, we found ourselves on top of Lhotse, which is the 4th highest mountain in the world. And you can actually see the summit of Mount Everest just right behind the National Geographic flag. And we were the only ones up there, and it was incredible. The silence was palpable. We realized, eventually what we'd accomplished. We spent nearly 48 hours in the death zone, as David said. I'd been living off Pringles and top ramen for days because that was all my stomach could handle. I can't even look at Pringles when I go home now. And I talked to Mother Nature. Having not slept for 50 hours, I had long conversations with Mother Nature because I was pretty much absolutely hallucinating the entire time. But what I did finally realize was that I felt gratitude. Gratitude for being in this place and for being able to see the curvature of the earth with my own eyes. Gratitude for 2 beautiful children, and just gratitude for simply being alive. I was back and I was better for all the experience that had led me to this particular moment. So when I got home, I decided to apply for a National Geographic grant to go and climb this really remote peak in Myanmar called Hakakaborazi. Has anybody ever heard of Hakakaborazi? Exactly. It took 2 years to plan this expedition, and as a team of 6, we decided that we were going to take a very old-fashioned approach to this trip by doing our whole trip overland. So we went about 1,000 miles overland by train, bus, boat, and motorcycles. And then, it almost sounds ridiculous coming out of my mouth, but then we walked for 150 miles just to get to base camp. So what we didn't realize was that the hardest part of the trip was still ahead of us. We'd just come out of the jungle with snakes, spiders, the worst leeches I've ever come across, walking across crazy bridges built by just strings of bamboo. And we get to this environment where we think we're going to be comfortable, but instead we just got crushed. Along the way, we had been extorted by military outposts of a lot of our rice rations, and so we were very short on food. From base camp, the climbing was so circuitous and difficult that essentially our team dynamics collapsed under the pressure. We were so remote that even the smallest mistake would have some of the most dire consequences. In the end, we failed the summit, and more importantly, we failed as a team. And I took the brunt of that failure on my shoulders because it was my idea and I was the team leader. So my vulnerabilities had really been laid to bear on this 2-month trip, and I struggled with the mantra of shame in my head. I don't know if any of you have ever heard this over and over in your head, but you're not good enough, you don't belong here. I came home suffering from PTSD, and it took me months to wade through the fog in my brain. It was pretty much the closest I'd ever come to quitting climbing. Yet somehow I never wished that we hadn't tried. So I have a lot of quotes. I actually put quotes in my journals before I go on these expeditions, and then when times get really tough, like really tough, I'll read them and I'll be like, oh, I'm not actually failing, I'm just gaining empathy. Or I'm learning gratitude. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. The tragedy of life is often not in our failure, but rather in our complacency. Not in our doing too much, but rather in our doing too little. And not in our living above our ability, but rather in our living below our capacities. So since Myanmar, I've been on several big expeditions with renewed focus. I look back at the struggles I faced in Myanmar, and it motivates me to be better and stronger. I've now found a new voice through my experiences and know that there's a story to tell about my relationship with Mother Nature. I see that as my biggest challenge moving forward. I personally have gained so much from Mother Nature, gratitude, empathy, compassion, that I am afraid that our biggest failure as humankind could be in failing Mother Nature. There's a very, very, very fine line, like a paper screen or even a cell membrane, between life and death, success and failure, risk and complacency. And I work every day to remember that and to be thankful for all the lessons I've learned along this path. You never conquer a mountain. You just stand on the top a few moments. Then the wind blows your footprints away. Thanks.
So when you went to Myanmar, that was
Yeah.
relatively recent. Was what year?
It was fall of 2014.
And I mean, it was a time of such possibility
For
and
the country.
expectation there.
Right.
I mean, tell us if you experienced that.
Yeah, I mean, being in Myanmar that time, I think, was right as they were coming out. I mean, I'd been trying actually to do this expedition for 15, 20 years, and it was only just now that this most northern region of Myanmar had actually opened up. And the hope and the people that we came across there were some of the most amazing experiences I've ever had traveling in a different country. I would love to go back to this mountain, but I fear what is going on there now, and I fear that it is obviously it wouldn't be possible.
I mean, ironically, being shaken down by the military might have been a more predictive.
Oh, I mean, there are
episode.
so many stories. Our entire team got whisked away in this Range Rover to go to, against our choice, to go and speak with this military general who controlled the region, and that's a whole nother story.
Well, now you talk about a whole other story. I mean, as I read your career, I mean, there's so many things in that presentation that are exciting, but not quite as exciting as being traded for several goats to a Lebanese who wanted you as his third wife. So why don't you explain how that, explain that, if you
So
would.
I mean, maybe the general theme here is that I love climbing mountains and I'm good at it, and it's really amazing to have something you're good at in life. But what I really take away from most of these climbs are sort of the crazy adventures and the insights into these different cultures that I come across. And one of my very first expeditions was to Lebanon, and we were traversing sort of north of the whole country to the highest peak in Lebanon. And we started on the west side and we came out on the east side. And as we were coming out, there were these Hezbollah sort of embedded in the hillsides, and they were pointing guns at us. And you know, we're wondering essentially where the heck we'd come from and why we were there. And so we covered up and we were looking for shelter. And this goat herder, a fairly wealthy goat herder in the region, had this amazing home, and he invited us in. And before too long, he'd struck up a conversation with sort of the oldest male in our group, and his two wives, that I didn't know at the time, they communicated this to me, started showing me around the house. And I was like, wow, like, I mean, if you've traveled to...
You didn't know you were going to live there.
Yeah. The kitchen, you know, Yeah, they had kids running around. It was pretty funny. And I don't know, a couple hours went by and we left, and John, who was the one that the herder had been talking to, it was like, just kept patting me on the shoulder and laughing, and he was like, I got him up to like 7 or 8 goats. But then I just said, no, it's not enough. So, yeah.
No, but we're glad for that.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of the forum, a lot of the discussion can take a fairly academic form, but of course the success you've found, the passion that you have, was really something that was outside your front door in the Pacific Northwest more than anything in a classroom context. Is that really nature, or is it nurture? Is it because you could reach it and you had a stable environment, or can we learn this, or do you just come with that?
You know, that's a great question, because obviously I wonder that every day with my own kids, and I can't say that I necessarily want them to follow in my footsteps. And the path I have gone down is so far removed from what my parents and my grandparents grew up with and what they were familiar with. I mean, the number of times I have tried to explain to my father what a crampon is, for example, or an ice axe. It's so far removed. But at the same time, my parents imbued me with this sense of wilderness. And one really key thing I learned from growing up in this family, on this small boat for months on end, was how to deal with people, that human interaction. And I think that's something that we're all moving away from in this world, and it's tragic, and it's going to have really
actual interactions.
Like you talk to each other and you look each other in the eyes. And another big part was almost the opposite of that, was that I spent a lot of time by myself. So not with my iPad and not with a phone that I'm reading off of or anything, but just by myself, entertaining myself with card games or just imagination in my head. And I don't think we give ourselves that time to sort of have our own creativity in a quiet place.
Let's hear, everyone must have some questions. First, let's start in the room, then I'll collect some from the webcast. Who would have a question for Hilaree today? And there are microphones, which will pass, and then they can hear you all around the world. Right here, or right there, all right.
Hilaree, can you describe a moment when you thought you were closest to death and what that felt like?
Yeah, that was in 2013. I mean, I've had a lot of moments like that, but in 2013, I was at a base camp that we just arrived at. I was in India, and it snowed 2 meters in 24 hours. And if you can imagine, well, you can look out the window. You can't walk, you can't move in that. And right as dusk was settling, we were in this very narrow valley with huge peaks on either side of us. And we all heard this crack, and this massive avalanche started coming down. I mean, it gives me the chills thinking about it. And I remember there were 4 of us just standing here, and one of the guys just reached over and grabbed a shovel and just put it next to him. And we just stood there and waited. There was nowhere for us to go. And it came crashing down. We watched it just in the twilight. And then at the last second, we were just hit with that smoke and that dust that comes before an avalanche. And I mean, I thought we were all going to die. What we didn't quite realize was that there was this big berm. And when we'd made up the tent, the camp, we did that on purpose. But fortunately, it was deep enough that when the snow hit it, it actually turned the whole avalanche away from us. So in the morning when we went and looked, it was only 30 feet away. I remember one of the guys walking over and picking up this sort of like platypus thing and handing it to me, and it was whiskey. He's like, "You want some?" Yes. What did I feel in that moment? My life didn't flash before my eyes. I felt incredibly calm, and without sounding too cheesy, I felt gratitude. I mean, the easy part, and I say this not having had big illnesses I've dealt with or anything, but in many ways the easy part is dying and the hard part is living, is those that live beyond that person's death. So that's what I worried about and who I worried about. But my own sense of calm was like really just that gratitude, that feeling of gratitude. And having survived it, I want to live my life. And I want to live every day as full as I can.
Yeah, one of our questions from the web is that
really
failure teaches us about mortality, and why is it, do you think, why are we so reluctant to talk about death? You talk about those deaths on the way up the mountain or on that guide expedition.
Right. Well, and I feel it's especially prevalent in the U.S. to avoid the conversation of death. I think it's more of a topic, and I could be wrong, but more of a topic in Europe and other countries to talk about death. But it really is, having been with that woman and see how quickly, how fragile it is and how quickly it can happen.
When you can't do anything.
Especially when you can't do anything. I feel very privileged and lucky at a relatively young age to have a relationship with death. And I talk about it with my kids all the time. And I hope that it's more of a conversation, because we all are going to die. For good, it's the one thing we all have in common.
I think it's Linda. And then if you can, say who you are and where you're from.
Linda Spilker. I work at the Jet Propulsion Lab in California. I was just curious, what's next?
What's next? Well, I really like, now since Myanmar, I've taken my kids on different expeditions. So they've come to Kilimanjaro with me. They've trekked into 17,000 feet in Nepal to a base camp. I really like high altitude and testing myself there. I'm 45 years old, so I feel like every day I'm just getting stronger. I hope to go back into those mountains, back to Lhotse.
It's interesting, because coming from your perspective, you say, what's next? One of the questions is, you know, if you had time to take a break or take a rest from it all.
Yes, I mean, I took quite a big rest after Myanmar. And I actually didn't think I would come back to mountains after that trip. But yeah, I get really bored and antsy if I start resting, to be honest. I like the idea of resting, and I get super into it for like a day, and then I get...
While we go to the back, are you sure that's not itself fear of death? Like, you know, I'm bored, I'm antsy.
I always am like, my biggest fear is like living the next one day the same as the last day, or getting too comfortable, so...
Right in the back, I think there's one right there. And yeah, who you are and where you're from.
Hi, I'm Dovran. I'm from Israel. I'm known as the inventor of the USB flash drive, USB stick. So made my success stories and made my failures. And it's more a comment rather than a question. It seems that you are talking about difficulties, not about failures. Do you know what's a failure? I can tell you failure. What are failures? Yes? You raise money, you establish a company, you grab guys to go with you, you dream about the future, and then it crashes. That's a failure.
So what is the difference really between difficulties?
Is it failures or difficulties? That's a question I'm to ask.
Yeah.
Well, if you want to look at Myanmar in terms of the fact that it was the first time I had been officially associated with National Geographic and received an expedition grant from them, there was a ton of pressure on me to succeed, and in the end, I didn't succeed. And that working relationship with National Geographic suffered greatly, which affected my career. In the end, the story became such a story of human suffering and difficulty that I have since done things with National Geographic in terms of just talks about that particular expedition. But yeah, I mean, it affects my monetary income as well to fail on these things. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I do perceive things as difficult, but when I am a guide and I'm responsible for my clients and their lives and their safety, and someone dies on my watch, I consider that very much a failure. And I've spent a long time trying to turn it into a difficulty.
Well, I think the sort of extraordinary curse of the forum is to meet extraordinary people, Hilaree, like you, and then to have only 30 minutes to talk with them. But
yeah, great.
but you've really, I think, lit up the room with what you've accomplished, and maybe there's some lessons for all of us. And thank you very much.
Yeah,
for coming
thank
today.
you. Thanks so much. Thanks.